working. It's working. It's all right. It's working. Lovely. Brilliant. I just need to say which one it is. That's all.
Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to Bolton Priory. It's lovely to see so many people here. I think it's the best turnout for a St. Cuthbert's lecture since I've been here over the last 5 years. I arrived here 5 years ago and realised that it was an annual lecture series, but COVID wiped out the first two, so they didn't happen. And then in the last 3 years, we've had a sort of constitutional talk from the former Attorney General, Dominic Grieve. We then had an interfaith talk from the journalist Peter Oborne. And this year, my third year of St. Cuthbert's lectures, we've got a historical one. And I'm delighted to say that we have two very eminent historians who are going to deliver the lecture this afternoon. First and foremost, we've got Professor Sir Ian Kershw. Ian, welcome, along with your family. Professor Kershw, as I said, has a very distinguished career. He was educated at the University of Liverpool and then Merton College, Oxford, and he originally trained as a medievalist before turning his attention to Nazi Germany, which is his main part of his life's work. But he's returned to where he began, which was actually at Bolton Abbey, so welcome back to where you began. Alongside Professor Sir Ian Kershw, we have Professor David Stocker, who again is a medieval historian and archaeologist. He's a visiting professor at York University, and he studied history and the history of art at Cambridge University before taking an MA at York in medieval studies. He's got a very distinguished archaeological background. He's been director of the British Archaeological Association, honorary fellow, now affiliated researcher at the University of York, vice president of the Society for Medieval Archaeology, and was a research affiliate at St. John's College, Cambridge. Now, most of you will know the subject matter today. It is called a medieval mystery, and there was an article about it in one of our parish magazines, which said as follows: come and join the architectural historian, Professor David Stocker, and me, Ian Kershw, as we try to find an answer to the puzzle of the strange recess high up in the wall of the nave of the Priory Church. And if you look up there, to your left or right, to your right if you're sitting facing me, you'll see the recess. And we don't know what it's for. And they're going to try and help us today. This lecture came about when we got an email from Ian saying, could he walk up on the gangway up there and take pictures? And there is actually a staircase up to the recess and a staircase down. And I spoke to my church warden. We thought, no, it's too dangerous. So my other church warden, who's age 80, said, I'll go up. So he got up on a ladder and shinned up onto the ledge. And I thought, gosh, it would be pathetic if I didn't follow him. So I followed with my phone, and we photographed the passageway all the way along up to the recess and down again. But it's still, we're none the wiser, but I hope we'll be a bit wiser at the end of this lecture. So a big hand, please, for our two lecturers this afternoon.
Two-pulpit job. Many thanks to the rector for this kind invitation and for his generous remarks there at the beginning. I've been captivated by Bolton Priory since I was a student, and did my DPhil dissertation at Oxford on the account book of the Priory from the late 13th to the 1286 precisely to 1325, and also published at the time the dissolution rentals of the Priory. And it's a great pleasure to me for the wheels gone full circle. As you just heard, I was a modern historian working on Nazi Germany for many years. So it's been much more pleasurable to do this return to work on medieval history, in particular on Bolton Priory. All the countless times I've been here visiting, I've always wondered about this recess and what it was for, and it was because of that that I got in touch with David, and since then we've had a very interesting dialogue, and much of it carried out by email. It's much nicer to have a dialogue when it's face-to-face, like today on one previous occasion when we're here. But it's remained a mystery and oddity, and is, I think, unique. At any rate, I don't know anything like it anywhere. And so we're going to try and find some answers for this. Hamilton Thompson, the great historian, ecclesiastical historian of Bolton Priory, didn't know what it was for at all. And he said in his History of the Priory, published in 1928, that he said that the reason for the recess is not at all apparent. Oh, amen to that. And he thought that maybe it had been knocked through at the back, and if so, it couldn't have served any useful purpose other than that of ventilation, which seems an odd thing. And this church doesn't seem much in need of ventilation. And he also pointed out that partway up the wall there is a corbel sitting on its own in the middle of the wall. And Thompson said halfway between the recess and the floor is a corbel, for what purpose is not clear. So the great historian of Bolton Priory, Hamilton Thompson, didn't know, and we hope that we can offer a potential solution to that. My part here is simply that of the warm-up act. So I'm posing some of the questions, and I'll try and say something about the early history of the Priory, taking us down to the period of this recess, which was built in this nave that we're in around about 1240, and David will provide the answers to that. And then right at the out, when David's finished, I'll come back for a very brief coda, and then we'll hope to have some questions from you. Because what we're saying now is not definitive or cut and dry by any means. It can't be. A lot of it's conjecture and speculation, because down to 1240, down to the building of this nave, we have really as good as no written evidence about the Priory apart from charters. So we have charter evidence telling them when they got various lands and so on. Apart from that, until 1267 to be precise, there's no real written evidence from within the Priory about what was going on here. So a lot of it is speculation, and that goes, of course, not least then for this wall recess. What was it for? That's the key question, this wall passage. Of course, part of it then is for maintenance of the windows and so on, and down to the back windows there of the 13th century west front. That's nothing unusual to have a wall passage for maintenance reasons, but then why did it not just go straight across to the west front? Why did it need to go up and then down again? That's unclear. That's the unclear bit, why you needed the stairs going up, the recess there, and then stairs going down again, as opposed to just going flat across. So that's some of the question. This was built around about the 1240s or thereabouts, apart from this lower part of the wall, which is much older than that. And could this recess tell us, David will provide some answer, could it tell us anything about the liturgical arrangements in the Priory at that early stage? That's the question. So it raises questions too about the early history of the Priory. And we need to strip away from our vision everything that we see today in here. So, as I said, that early wall is late 12th century at the latest, maybe even earlier. Where we're sitting in this nave is around 1240. Nearly everything to the eastern side of that modern wall there is 14th century. Apart from the early bit just immediately to the other side of the wall, to the east of the wall. So, and what about a tower? Well, David will say more about that in due course. So, we have to just imagine a completely different priory to the one which we see today. And this wonderful eastern end, this beautiful eastern end in ruins, of course, was not built until between 1325 and 1340 or 50. and much of the rest of it. There was 14th century East End, 13th century here, and of course Prior Moon's Tower wasn't begun till 1520. So we're left in great measure with what we can deduce from the fabric of the building itself, which is David's area of expertise. But as I said, plenty of room for conjecture, and therefore plenty of room for you to ask questions and join in as we try to find these answers, which we can't ourselves find altogether. But as I said, it takes us back to the beginnings now, so let's just for a minute or two turn our attention to the very early period of the Priory then, and take it up to 1240. Say little to go on other than charter evidence then. And it was founded, as you probably all know, as Emsey, about 4 or 5 miles away from here in 1120, probably in the second half of 1120. My William Machine, who owned a lot of property in southern England and also was the Lord of Copeland in Cumberland, and Cecily de Rumilly, who was the Lady of the Honour of Skipton. And Emsey was given to the by Cecily de Rumilly. Emsey was initially given as the glebe of Skipton Church. So Skipton Church was originally given by William Machine to Huntingdon Priory, a long way away from here. And then in a separate gift, he and Cecily de Rumilly gave Skipton Church to the priory to be founded at Emsey, a priory of Our Lady, the Virgin Mary, and St. Cuthbert. And of course, this is St. Cuthbert's lecture, so it's a great honour to be speaking in Bolton Priory in terms of a lecture in the memory of St. Cuthbert. One of the mysteries about Emsey is why it was actually dedicated to St. Cuthbert. And nobody knows the plain answer to that. There was no cult of Cuthberts here, which is sometimes suggesting no cult of St. Cuthbert in this area. And the most likely bet, as Hamilton Thompson pointed out, is that the key to the dedication is not to be found round here, but it's to be found in Worksop, or possibly in Huntingdon. But Worksop Priory was founded also by, came also from Huntingdon. And the Worksop was also dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary and St. Cuthbert. So it's quite possible that the dedication of Emsey Priory, the double dedication there, came from Huntingdon via Worksop. It's even feasible that the first prior, Reginald, who almost certainly came from Huntingdon, maybe he picked up a very small band of brothers, very tiny number, at Worksop possibly en route, and brought them over to Emsey. So we'll never know the reason why St. Cuthbert was the dedication, but it remained a dedication at Emsey. It was not transferred to here, to Bolton. So this was also in monastic times only dedicated to the Virgin Mary, not to St. Cuthbert. So the Cuthbert dedication came later. At what point, I don't know. And my guess would be the 19th century, but maybe the rector knows better than that. I don't know. But the Cuthbert dedication at Emsey remained throughout the Middle Ages. And there was obviously a chapel retained at Emsey, which is not necessarily the case normally for monastic foundations. If they moved, they didn't normally keep another chapel or whatever in the place they moved from, or retained an education, which we know was the case from various documents at Bolton. And so that continued there, and there must have been therefore a chapel and presumably a house there, because at one time in the 15th century, the prior of Bolton, Prior Green, retired there. So maybe there was already a house which was the chapel served by the canons of Bolton, maybe a retired canon. It was probably a nice number then for the canons for a retired canon then to take up residence at Emsey. It was a house of regular canons. These were part of the great monastic revival of the late 11th century, initially in Italy and then in northern France, and they came to England at the beginning of the 12th century. The early foundations were St. Botolph's in Colchester and Huntingdon, already mentioned, which then Huntingdon spawned a number of daughter houses, including MC, but also Hexham, Worksop, as I mentioned, and Bolton Priory too. So in Yorkshire, the Augustinians, as they were by that time coming to be called, regular canons were not just initially then Augustinians, and they were called regular canons because they followed a rule which became then the rule of St. Augustine, which was coming in the early 12th century. Augustinian houses were founded, houses of regular canons were founded in Yorkshire at Nostell near Pontefract, at Bridlington, at MC as mentioned, at Gisborough and at Kirkham. And all of these were given big grants of churches, apart from MC, which was given a very poor endowment, just the Skipton Church initially with its chapel at Carlton. And later on, in the 1130s, also acquired Kildwick, which isn't too far away. And Kildwick Church, the proceeds from Kildwick Church and from Skipton Church were the basis of the endowment of the priory, which then got, apart from some land in Malham, didn't have very much more that was given to it in the early period, apart from Skibden and manors of Skibden and Sturton, which were then exchanged when the move to Bolton took place in 1155. Bolton was described as the capital manor of Alistair Rumley, the daughter of Cecily, the capital manor. But in Domesday Book, it seems strange to us today with Skipton, a thriving market town. Skipton was a mere village of no importance whatsoever at that time. Bolton was the more important place by far. And the move from MC to Bolton, described as the capital manor of Alistair Rumley then, was for what reason? Well, probably the simplest explanation is the best one. They wanted it because the land here was so much more fertile and worth a lot more than MC. MC was one of the high, if not the highest, land on which an Augustinian priory was built in England, 607 feet above sea level. The land there is pretty infertile. It would largely only grow oats, which was the most inferior crop. When they moved here, Bolton was worth at least twice as much as MC. And the crops they could grow here allowed them to produce wheat, which was the best of the crops, and had far better return. So it was a very good deal for them. There was one other possibility, though, that they might also, in addition to the fact that Bolton was worth so much more than MC, so much a better land offering them scope for development and expansion. Bolton also what provided them maybe with greater solitude. These in the early 12th century, the very pious age, the need for contemplative peace and quiet was very important for these monastic orders, and the Augustinians were no different from that. And Bolton offered then greater prospects, great possibilities for solitude and for the contemplative life, probably than in MC, which was only about a mile away from Skipton, then where they got the castle and everything and the hustle and bustle of the Rumleys. What did they find when they came to Bolton in 1155? Still a very poor house. What did they find here? Well, the Domesday Book records this entire area as being waste. It doesn't necessarily mean there was absolutely nothing here, but it wasn't a land of great value. Was there then any ecclesiastical remnants here? David will say more about this later, I think. Whitaker, in writing his History of Craven at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries, spoke of the Saxon cure. He called it a Saxon cure. Was there then already a pre-existing church? Hamilton Thompson was uncertain about that. tended to be very skeptical about it. But if you bear in mind the fact that Bolton was much more important than Skipton, and we ask the question, what was Skipton Parish before there was a Skipton Parish? Because there wasn't a Skipton Parish until the Rumleys turned up there in the late 11th century and built the church next to the castle. The likelihood is that because the parochial structure already existed in this part of Yorkshire, the likelihood is that if there was a parish around here, that it was centred upon Bolton. So there's a probability, not that we can prove it, I think, from any existing information, there's a strong probability that there was already a church here when the canons arrived in 1155. If so, where was it situated? David will maybe say something about that. But apart from the fact this is better land, as I've already said, they were looking for greater solitude, perhaps. Were they influenced by the Cistercians at all? This was the heyday, in the middle of the 12th century, the heyday of Fountains Abbey, only about 20 miles away, and of Rievaulx Abbey under the great Abbot Aelred. Rievaulx, under Aelred's time, it was said, according to Walter Daniel's Life of Aelred, that there were about 140 choir monks there, about 240 lay brothers, and about 260 paid servants. So altogether, about 600 people on the site at Rievaulx. So Rievaulx and Fountains were famous houses at the time there, whose influence was widespread, and it's quite conceivable that influence affected Bolton too, which David might comment on later. Now, one point about Cistercian influence seems to me to be fairly clear from the beginning, is that the canons of Bolton, when they arrived here, if they found people living in a village around here, and if so, it's probably a small village, but if they found people living here in a village, then it seems that they cleared that village away. So in the entire time where there was a monastery here, between the 12th century and the 16th century, there's no trace of a village of Bolton Abbey or Bolton at all. So the likelihood is that the canons then cleared them away, which is a practice more associated with the Cistercians than with the Augustinians, and resettled them in the immediate vicinity, probably across the wharf there in Storitz, amongst other places perhaps. But so then the question arises: who used this nave then? If there was no parish if the parish effectively ceased, then when the canons took over here, there were no parishioners of a conventional kind, no villagers here. So who used this nave then? Presumably it was then used by the servants of the priory, the workers of the priory, and so on, but not by local tenants and so on, and people that they'd resettled elsewhere. So the area around it, but not by an actual village of Bolton any longer. Now, late 12th and early 13th centuries appeared of some expansion of land in the areas round about, but Bolton was still, by the time we come to the period where there's some documentary evidence of it, from the 1260s onwards, was still a poor monastic house. Its income was still low. We know that from the accounts which survived from the 1280s onwards. So the question is then, and we know that it was already, the eastern part of the church was in a poor state from the visitation by Archbishop Wickwayne in 1280, a decree by Archbishop Corbridge in 1304, that the eastern end of the church was in a poor state. So if it's poor and so on, and the eastern end's been up for a couple of 100 years by then in not good condition, how did they afford this ornate and expensive nave about 1240? The answer must be from benefactors, and the richest benefactors were the descendants of the Rumleys, the Forts family, with great landowners again, William de Forts, the second Count of Aumale, Lord of Holderness, and of Skipton. He died in 1241, round about the time that this nave was built. So the likelihood is, I think, that this was funded by him or perhaps by his successor in his memory, William de Force III. And at that time then, the new nave was built, and as part of this new nave, this intriguing recess, which we're now going to hear more about from David. So at that point, let me finish my bit and hand over to David, and I'll come back for a very brief comment at the end. Okay, thank you very much for now.
Thank you, Ian. Ian's just given us an extraordinary introduction to the Priory here, but what we're really here to talk about today is this strange architectural feature in the nave, this mystery, as we tend to call it. So can I have the first slide, please? I'll skip the introductory section and we'll go straight on to the mystery itself. We need to start by looking at the oddities in the fabric at the west end of the nave south wall, which have caused everybody to be so puzzled. There are a number of them, and I'm going to go through them so that you understand why we're puzzled and why we're gathered here today. First, the western 20 feet of the south wall of the nave were built 13 inches thicker than the remainder. You can see that if you look carefully. This considerable thickness of this length of wall is neither expected nor paralleled in any other monastic church nave that we've encountered. Have the next one, please. Secondly, this thickened length of wall in the southwest corner of the nave contains a steep staircase, of which you've heard of from the vicar, within its thickness. Indeed, this feature would not have been possible without such a thickening of the wall. The staircase rises upwards from the passage that runs along the sills of the nave south aisle windows, and such passages along the sills of windows are the norm, in fact, in great churches. They even thought to have served as service corridors, allowing craftspeople access to the windows for erecting ladders, for example, removing glass, making other repairs, that sort of thing. And we presume that was what most of the passageway here was for, except that at the point at which the walls thickens, you'll see that there is this staircase, and there's an image of it on the screen. Can I have the next one, please? The purpose of this staircase appears to be solely to reach the sill of this quite remarkable round arched opening into the nave, high up in the wall, tucked up under the eaves. Then, continuing westwards this passage, beyond the high-level opening, the passage communicates with another steep flight of stairs that goes downwards towards the same sort of access passage along the sills of the west windows. It's already been said, but I'll say it again. We must stress that the only justification for this staircase seems to be to gain access to that round arch opening under the eaves. Yet it's a complicated structure, this staircase and the arched opening. It must have been designed before the wall was built, and it was installed during its construction. We can show that. It represents considerable thought and care, undertaken solely to give access to this high-level opening looking down into the nave. We should stress, as I think has already been said, that this arrangement is most unusual. To repeat, we would normally expect the service passage along the sills of the windows to go straight the way round on the level and not to behave in this remarkable manner. As the staircase's purpose seems to be to access this round-headed arch under the eaves, we need to inspect that feature thoroughly also. The first thing that strikes you about it is that it's round-headed. You'll know that this is not a usual 13th century arch form, particularly in a building such as this, where the newly fashionable two-centred pointed arch dominates all other architectural features, as in the arcade or in the windows in the west end. We should also note that the arch is definitely not an later insertion into this wall. Its jamstones coursed through with the masonry skin of the wall perfectly, and similarly the stones forming its archhead were clearly laid along with the masonry surrounding them. This is a well-designed, well-constructed architectural feature then, belonging to the wall's primary phase of construction. But despite its evident quality of construction, The archway carries no mouldings, and the opening makes no architectural statement. It was hoping to vanish from sight in the dim light of the eaves. Whilst the round-headed archway up into the eaves is evidently carefully designed and well constructed, it was apparently part of the original nave fabric of 1240. The opening's sill is missing today. The jambs ought to be supported on a single still stone, or at least 2 or 3 large blocks. Instead, you can see where that sill has been removed and replaced by a number of much smaller, crudely cut stones to pack it. The sill has been removed from this interesting archway. I presume the fill was put in during the 19th century. For those of you keeping count, that's 5 oddities. The 6th is that we should note the round-headed arch in the eaves sits above this very large panel of completely blank masonry, extending right down to the nave floor. That blank panel is actually most unexpected in a building of this date and quality and detail. At the very least, one might expect some form of blank arcading at that point, or some wall painting, elaborate wall painting to break up the wall surface, but there's nothing. Within that blank panel, however, there is only one feature, this isolated corbel, which you can see on the screen. This is a simple feature, same bed height of the masonry around it, within which it sits. It takes a form similar to most corbels of circa 1240, with a simple quarter circle nose, neatly chamfered edges. As far as we can tell from below, the corbel's table is about 1 foot square. But the corbel's most important characteristic, and the characteristic that we suggest reveals its purpose, is that it is located plumb center below the opening above, the round-headed archway above. And such precision of location is unlikely to have been achieved by chance, and consequently we think the corbel's purpose relates closely to the round-headed archway above. So, to summarise, the western end of the nave south wall was originally designed in around 1240 to contain an unusual round-headed opening at high level, hidden in the darkness of the eaves. The opening sat within a length of wall that had been deliberately thickened, and it was reached by staircases that rose within the thickness of the wall from the service passages below the windows in the south and west walls. Although the opening was apparently the focus of these design oddities in this part of the church, it was a simple feature, not decorated with mouldings or otherwise emphasised, so one might say that it was purely functional rather than decorative. It has lost its original sill, which has been replaced by smaller stones, presumably during a subsequent restoration. And finally, and critically for its interpretation, the opening was intimately related to the single large corbel sitting plumb centre in the wall beneath it and separated from it by a large expanse of completely blank wall. This collection of unusual features has puzzled or aggravated previous writers about Bolton, but mostly it's been ignored completely. It's sometimes been thought that it might have been some form of high-level gallery extending across the nave, but there's absolutely no evidence for any such feature of this sort in the north wall, and it's too high for such a gallery anyway and would have interfered with the west walls. You've heard already what Hamilton Thompson had to say about it. He was clearly completely puzzled, as everybody else has been. So have the next slide, please. Ta-da! The key to this, to our new proposal for understanding this group of unusual features then, is the large corbel placed plumb centre beneath the round-headed arch high in the eaves. We suggest that this corbel was placed here during the wall's construction in order to support a substantial timber post rising against the area of blank walling to support a timber platform onto which the round-headed arch in the eaves gave access. Any such timber platform would have required anchoring into the wall, of course, and we suggest that that was the purpose of a hefty timber sill, also incorporated in the wall during construction, into which the proposed platform would be fixed with powerful carpentry joints. The proposed platform would thus have been both anchored into the wall through the sill and supported from below by the post standing on the isolated corbel. No doubt such a high-level platform would have carried some sort of guardrail around its external edge. So our study of this unusual feature and these unusual structural features leads us to suggest that this part of the building originally contained this remarkable structure. In order to access this structure, the access to this structure is equally remarkable. It would have been solely through the service passageways running along the staircase, and if you go down this end, you'll find that it's been blocked up when the new 14th century transept was imposed, and therefore, whatever this strange thing is, it went out of use when the transepts were imposed on the building in the 14th century. Having reconstructed this unusual feature, we must now ask what on earth such a high-level timber platform, what purpose such a high-level timber platform might serve. It's surely placed too high and too obscurely to have played any direct part in activity on the nave floor, although we shall return to ask what liturgy was intended in the new nave in a moment. We suggest that the key to understanding the purpose of the platform lies in the unusual thickening of the wall at this point. Thompson tried to explain this thickening by suggesting some complicated form of mistake by the builders in the layout of the new nave. But that sort of explanation doesn't carry much weight with people like me these days, because the designers of expensive and impressive buildings such as this wouldn't tolerate such a basic error when setting out the building. Furthermore, the south face of the West Range's north wall is in fact in line with the remainder of the wall, and there's no error actually in setting out the building at this point. So making the north wall of the north wall of the West Range, the thickening of the wall, is actually substantially thicker than the other three walls of the West Range, which is on the other side. Could I have the next slide, please? We should ask instead why a 20-foot length of wall, the south wall, might be thickened in that fashion. Well, in many contemporary churches, such wall thickening often betrays the presence of bellcot. Where such bellcots cannot be given buttresses at critical points, in order that they can resist the considerable torque and impose when the bells are swung, the entire wall is thickened. And we propose that that was the purpose of the thick wall at Bolton too. It was intended to support a bellcot. A bellcot on the western end of the nave's south wall at Bolton would not only explain the wall thickening, though, it would also suggest a function for our reconstructed high-level timber platform, which would have provided the space from which the putative bells could have been rung in the fashion you see here. We'll consider in a moment why such a bell-ringing platform might be located at such a high level rather than using long ropes hanging down to the nave floor. In a moment, we'll consider that in a minute. Could I have the next, please? Yet once, if there was once a bellcot on the top of the western end of the nave's south wall, there is no sign of that feature today. Unfortunately, any physical evidence for it would have been swept away when the nave roofline was lowered and the parapet was rebuilt in the 1520s. At the end of the south wall, however, the surviving parapet today is 19th century, in fact, 19th century reconstruction, and up until that reconstruction work, there were no crenellations at all on this part of the wall. So we're suggesting that this original bellcot was aligned east-west, and that it would have risen above the roof of the monastic West Range, whose outline we can see in the current fabric. Bells placed in this putative bellcot would thus have rung out across the monastic buildings, but we are suggesting that they would have been operated by a ringer standing on our proposed platform, timber platform, tucked away, practically unnoticeable in the dark eaves, high above the west end of the nave of the church. How can we possibly explain, why such an elaborate arrangement was thought desirable? Have the next slide, please. Initially, we must ask what sort of activities were intended in this new nave of 1240. The mere fact that Bolton's nave survived in use as a church after the dissolution suggests that there was an established secular use of the nave at the time of the dissolution. This would make Bolton one of several dozen monastic churches nationally where the presence of lay rites in the monastic nave ensured continuing use of part or all of the building after the dissolution. Many such monasteries were of the Benedictine order, as at Holy Trinity York here, or Selby, to take Yorkshire examples. But Augustinian examples occur also. Can the next one, please? In Yorkshire, the most famous Augustinian examples, apart from Bolton itself, of course, are Bridlington, and within the northern province, parochial naves were also retained at Augustinian houses at Brinkburn, Hexham, Lanercost, Worksop, and Thurgerton. Indeed, at Bolton, there is contemporary archiepiscopal documentation confirming that there was a lay congregation using the nave at Bolton at the dissolution. Now, the next one, please. Following the example of many Benedictine monasteries, as Ian's already said, Whitaker, the great antiquarian of Craven, suggested that there had been a secular parochia at Bolton, established perhaps in the 10th or 11th centuries, and that the Augustinian community had been superimposed upon that putative church in the 1150s by the Rumenes. However, there are considerable difficulties, and Ian's already explained a lot about that, so I won't expend much time on it today. I think we can skip straight to the. Before we do, just before we go on to the next, one of the interesting possibilities about this early church, which we're going to talk a little bit about later, this early church, is that it was actually the church of a hermit. Such hermits were owners of their chapels, and they usually owned a bit of land around them, and they were sort of outside the parochial structure. And they were, in the 12th century, quite a number of them persuaded to join newly founded convents and to donate their chapels to those monasteries as part of the foundation of the monasteries and as part of the process of monastic fervour that was sweeting the land in the 12th century. That sort of arrangement happened at Kirkstall, and documentation for that process has been revealed in great detail by Katie Dutton's work at Kirkstead in Lincolnshire. Could I have the next one, please? Thompson also suggested that this early chapel might have existed, that an early chapel might have existed on this site. And that remains the majority of opinion, I think, amongst other commentators. But Thompson thought that the chapel was represented by the walls below the Romanesque arcading in the choir. And Ian and I have looked hard at that masonry, and we would say that Thompson is demonstrably incorrect about that. There's no reason whatsoever to think that the fabric below the Romanesque arcading is earlier than the Romanesque arcading itself. And it's just not clear why the 12th century builders would have part demolished an earlier fabric in order to rebuild this arcade on top of it. Instead, when hunting for the location of this proposed pre-existing chapel at Bolton, we should look for unusual features in the layout of the Priory church. Such anomalies are not found within the monastic choir out there, but they focus around these western crossing piers behind me, which are sited in asymmetrical fashion. They don't line up with each other, with the nave or with the choir beyond, and it's very much as though they were trying to accommodate some pre-existing building in what is now the eastern end of the nave. Indeed, the walls of the earlier building might have been retained as buttressing for the later crossing tower, which we, or the crossing itself anyway, which we need to do some more work on. We aren't finished understanding that. Nevertheless, the retention of this earlier building would certainly explain why that pier in particular is so misaligned with the remainder of the crossing. It may even be that the south wall of the present nave this wall contains some fabric from the pre-existing building, though Ian and I have further work to do on that also. It's certainly conceivable that for some reason obscure to us today, it was felt necessary to rebuild the pre-existing secular chapel on this footprint. And if that were the case, we would have to explain why it was then again rebuilt only 90 years later, and so that perhaps is not such a convincing argument. Details in the fabric of the circa 1155 church suggest to us then that not only was there a pre-existing structure on this site where we're sitting tonight, but when the canons moved here, but that it occupied very much this space. That's where the evidence seems to point in the area we're sitting in today. When the canons laid out their new East End around 1155, they adopted what's called the standard Bernardine plan, which is copied directly from contemporary Cistercian churches, with the high altar only slightly projected forward, flanked by rows of altars in both transepts. And I suggest to you that the choice of that design for the new church was significant, because by doing that, the canons were associating themselves with the monastic reform, as exemplified by the austerity of the Cistercian monks in particular. This was not the way that monasteries had been planned previously. But we remain unclear how much of the church was built during that first campaign of building. It's at least possible that the earlier building, whose presence we can detect in the surviving fabric, as I've indicated, stood attached to this new transept. And it's possible that this building, which is a sort of ghost in amongst us, stood right the way through as the nave to the new East End, right the way through until the structure we see today was built. That previous structure here could easily be separated from the priory buildings rising around it, and which would have been required to maintain the enclosure of the convent and to prevent the canons from coming in direct contact with the laity. But it's likely that the local secular community using the nave would have heard Mass performed at their altar by one of the canons themselves. The canons performing that service for the laity will have found access to the secular nave from their new transept very convenient. Perhaps it was somewhere here. But we have to leave these debates about the development of Bolton's church as a whole there for a moment and return to our chosen inquiry into the canon's use of bells. Can I have the next one, please? Before we focus on the canons, though, we ought perhaps first to ask how the secular community living in this ghost church here, what their requirement was for bells. And recent studies suggest that bells in such communities were used principally for giving warning of the approach of the 3 daily services that were required: matins, mass and evensong. And usually they were rung for 5 minutes at an hour beforehand. Such bells were not mandated by the church authorities and were entirely the responsibility of the community themselves. And indeed we might doubt whether the secular community at Bolton actually had any bells at all at this early date. By complete contrast, the Augustinian canons were not only required to have bells, but they were required to use them in a much more tightly prescribed manner to mark their canonical hours and to regulate their services. Their use at Bolton Priory is described in the surviving custom. Could I have the next one, please? We've already seen that the Bolton canons adopted the Cistercian Bernardine plan for the layout of their new choir in the 1150s, and we suspect that their subsequent use of bells, as apparent from our reconstruction of the platform in the southwest corner of the nave, offers further evidence that the monastic ethos at Bolton was also inspired by the Cistercian reform. Our suggestion for this extraordinary arrangement, the extraordinary arrangements made for ringing bells in the new nave of circa 1240, might argue that the strict ordinations of the Cistercians' bell ringings, Cistercians' ordinations regarding ringing bells, were also important to the Augustinians of Bolton. let's move on from there. Thompson thought that he could also identify some Cistercian inspiration in certain design features of the later 12th century building. But it is the plan of the new eastern parts of the church here that represent an important public expression, the main public expression of the character of monastic life and liturgy that was going on within the new priory. The new building was making a clear statement to all those who could read it that this foundation was inspired by Cistercian ideals of simplicity and equality before God, and even if they were not following the exacting lifestyle of the Cistercians in other respects. Integral with the discussion of Cistercian liturgical performance amongst past generations of architectural historians has indeed been the debate over the provision of bells in new convents. Can I have the next one, please? In the British Isles, this international debate has been led by the eminent scholar Peter Ferguson and is continued to this day by others, particularly by Stuart Harrison. Harrison demonstrated quite a long list of earlier English Cistercian churches using this Bernardine plan were following many French examples, such as those we will see in a moment, and were built without crossing towers, with the nave roof extending continuously through to the eastern crossing arch. According to Harrison, it was only in the 1150s that certain English Cistercian churches, such as Fountains and Kirkstall, erected structural crossing towers at all. Even so, it's important for us to note for this study that none of those crossing towers contained bells. Ferguson demonstrated quite clearly that they provided top light for the monks' choir below and not bell ring spaces. Can I have the next one, please? Across Europe, both bells and towers were highly contentious. The Cistercians in the 1150s spent most of their time in their general chapter debating them. On the one hand, bells were very necessary for various purposes, but on the other, they were a potential source of pride and display, which was inimical to the Cistercian ethos. And other orders were also concerned about the potential damage to their image that undisciplined uses of bells could cause within their own rules. Consequently, in 1157, the Cistercians issued their famous statute on the construction of bell towers and guidance on the numbers and specific uses of bells. The 1157 statute forbade the construction of bell towers altogether, and it gave particular details about the way bells should be used. Their injunctions said that there were to be only 2 bells in any convent, the greater bell and the lesser bell, though it seems that a smaller third bell might be permitted within the refectory. Neither of the 2 main bells was to exceed 500 weight, not only to combat pride, as they said, but also because the bells must be easily rung by a single monk to prevent lavish displays when ringing. The great and the lesser bells were never to be rung together, because that would seem immodest, and because 2 bells were to be given different meanings, the brothers needed to learn the tones and the voice, as they call it, of each. The great bell was to be rung for liturgical purposes only, to call the brethren immediately to those services that contained a full mass, that is, Vigil, Prime, Lauds and Vespers. Notably, the great bell was also rung once before and after the principal meal and after the midday rest period, emphasizing the canonical nature of those 2 activities. The lesser bell, on the other hand, was to be rung for the services of collation and compline, apparently suggesting that these services had a different quality compared with the greater services. And importantly, says the injunction, the lesser bell was to be rung only once at the elevation of the host during Mass in the church. All that heard the lesser bell rung once were to stop what they were doing immediately, to genuflect to the east, and to make a prayer that God inspires. The lesser bell was also to be rung twice only, to mark the the moment of interment of a monk or of a guest who had died inside the convent. In the Cistercian context, the monks themselves would be present at the Mass at which the lesser bell was rung, unless in the infirmary, so this sounding of the bell would be aimed at lay brothers and servants in the monastery. Cistercians then envisaged a convent possessing only 2 bells that served both practical and sacred functions. Those bells were to be used for a range of very specific purposes within the church and precinct, and it's very clear from contemporary injunctions against towers that it was envisaged that the bells would not be placed in such showy architectural structures. Instead, this is what we frequently find amongst the earliest architectural remains of Cistercian abbeys in France, where such remains survive so much better than they do in England. In France, many Cistercian monasteries preserve their early bell cots, often with space for just 2 bells, typically placed on the gable of the south transept of the church, though at Valmagne Abbey, the huge bell cot was placed on the south aisle of the church. In some churches, such as Le Thoronnais, the bells were divided between 2 locations, a simple stone belfry containing a single bell balanced on top of the crossing vault, and a cote for a single bell on the north transept gable, in that case because it faces the cloister. In the British Isles, detailed fabric studies of places like Rievaulx by Ferguson, Stallion, Harrison and others have established that although there was no crossing towers in these churches until the 14th century, bell cots addressing the cloister did exist. And at Rievaulx in particular, it's been demonstrated that the remains are buried within the later transept. Stuart Harrison has also suggested that the same sort of arrangement, that is no crossing tower, but a bell cot on the south transept, also existed at Waverley, Tinton, Fountains, Melrose, Whitland, Margam, Dunbrody and Mellifont. And in none of those do the walls survive high enough to provide the architectural evidence. Those bell cots were presumably also contained 2 bells that were sounded across the convent. We can presume, perhaps, that such bells would have been used, such bell ringing would have been imitated by other monastic orders. And that really is what we're suggesting to you today, that Bolton is imitating that sort of use of bells, that bell discipline applied at Bolton as well. So, can I have the next one, please? Presuming that the Cistercian influence on monastic observance at Bolton was strong, the convent may have been restricting itself to just 2 bells to be used for those specific purposes, and they should have been avoiding having a crossing tower altogether. And indeed, that is what we see. That is what the fabric shows us. It shows us that there were 2 bells and there was no crossing tower. Can I have the next one, please? Furthermore, the roof of the church planned by the canons of Bolton in the 1150s would probably therefore have been continuous through the crossing area, and in fact there's architectural evidence at high level here that suggests that that was the case. Can I have the next one, please? Having suggested that bells might have been treated very carefully in the convent of Bolton, following Cistercian practice by earlier generations of canons of Bolton from the 1150s, we now need to move 90 years forward to the time in the 1140s when the fine new nave we are sitting in today was under construction, and at last we're moving towards an explanation of why the bells might be mounted in this remarkable manner, for which we've offered some evidence at the west end of the South Aisle wall. If our reconstruction of the bell cot was correct, then that in itself is evidence that the canons of 1240 were going to remarkable lengths, astonishing lengths. On the one hand, to demonstrate that they were adhering to a discipline in the use of bells that is similar to and inspired by the Cistercians, and on the other, that they were doing trying to do so and separate the bell ringer from the laity. Recalling the clear signs we've already noted that the canons of Bolton were inspired by the Cistercians in their early years, our new evidence must raise the question of whether that influence, that inspiration from the Cistercians continued to the point in the 1240s when they were building their new nave. And that is what it looks like. They continued, we've shown you the evidence, that they continued to restrict themselves to just 2 bells, and that those bells were located in an unusual position to sound across the convent, and at this stage they did not opt for a coshing tower either. Again, like their contemporaries in the Cistercian order, they were following that same discipline. We've surmised, however, if this were a Cistercian house, the bellcot would have been on the transept. And we've surmised that the Bolton bellcot was apparently relocated from that presumed site on the transept into this most unconventional location at the west end of the south wall. Why should that be? Well, in addition to Cistercian inspiration, a second change would have surely been influential on the canons of Bolton in their liturgical planning in the 1240s, and their use of bells would have been greatly affected by the codification of the doctrine of the Mass in the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, when the real presence of Christ in the Mass was affirmed, and when the ringing of a bell at the moment of elevation of the host became a compulsory requirement. And the Cistercians themselves recognized the importance of that moment in 1215 and reissued their injunctions about bells and told their convents to buck up and follow this new rule. So, could the unusual location of the bellcot at the west end of Bolton be related to the new locations at which Mass was going to be performed in the new nave, so that the ringing of bells could be coordinated? Can I have the next one, please? Prior to the 1230s, one or more of the canons of Bolton would have been performing Mass every day in the old nave, behind a screen, for the benefit of the laity, and to fulfill their obligations as priests. How the ringing of the lesser bell was coordinated with the elevation of the host at lay altars prior to the rebuilding of the nave is unknown, and perhaps it's best not to speculate about that. But in planning for their new nave of the 1230s, the building in which we sit, the canons had the opportunity to regularize the arrangements for interaction between the canons and the laity. And most importantly, perhaps, they evidently constructed our proposed platform in order to coordinate the ringing of the bells with the performances of Mass in the new nave, as was now required after the Lateran Council. It's likely then that the new nave after 1240 would contain 3 altars, well, 2 or 3 altars, one in the north aisle over there. We can tell where the altars were because of the piscinas. There would have been Mass performed there behind a screen, head-high screen, about where I'm standing. And the laity would be in that part, and the canons would be over here, and the 2 were not to meet. The canons would no doubt approach these altars from the transept side, and the new bellcot, the new ringing arrangements would mean that the bells could be rung by the sacristan or his deputy, a canon, without interacting with the people in the nave. That's the purpose. And in fact, this passageway would have run round to the night stairs and the canon's dormitory. We can show that. And so that's how they got here. They came from the dormitory round here to ring the bells and to coordinate the ringing of bells with the performance of Mass at these new altars that they were providing for the laity. Our proposed new platform would have given an excellent view of the naves, these altars here, but it would also allow the canons to look through the tower arch, the crossing arch, as far as the old high altar position. You couldn't see from up there right the way through to the 14th century or high altar, but you could to the 12th century one. So all of the altars were actually visible from this location. So, if we're correct that the new arrangements for bell ringing within the convent in the mid-13th century indicated a continuing ambition to follow Cistercian monastic practice, at least in this use of bells, this ambition seems to have dissipated by the second quarter of the 14th century, if not a bit earlier. The comprehensive rebuilding program that Ian talked about in the second quarter of the 14th century obscured, made impossible the access to the old ringing platform. Although Thompson did note that there was a change of use in the west range of the cloister at this same period, and that the back wall of the recess might have been broken through at that stage, and that might have given an alternative way up. So, can I have the final slide, please? To summarise, the structural archaeology of the strange... yes, I think we'll go on one more, please. Thank you. To summarise, the structural archaeology of the strange arch feature high up in the nave, south wall at Bolton, above your heads, leads us to the conclusion that this originally opened into a wooden platform on which canons were able to ring bells in line with the elevation of the mass at the nave altars, and this was something which they valued in 1240, partly because it was imitating or keeping up the tradition that the Cistercians had laid down, and partly because it kept them in line with the contemporary liturgical requirements that have been laid out in the Lateran Council of 1215. And I'm now going to hand over back to Ian to, I don't know what are you going to say?
Well, it'd be very good if we could move on to questions and discussion very shortly. I just want to a couple of final points after David's exposition there. The point about the bell codes I find compelling, the reason for that recess, the bell code that he's described and shown the diagram, I find that absolutely compelling. The lasting influence of the Cistercians is something on which David and I disagree a little bit, I think. David's pointed to a great deal of that and emphasized it all the way through his talk. I have no difficulty whatsoever in assuming that the Cistercian influence in the middle of the 12th century was considerable. It was, generally speaking, considerable, not just here. And the heyday of the Cistercians, as I mentioned before, Fountains and Rievaulx in particular at the time. But then it was not just influential here or in Augustinian priories. For example, the Bernardine East End, the flat East End that David pointed out here, was also used at Mark Breton Priory near Barnsley. Monk Breton near Barnsley, which is a Cluniac monastery. And the Cluniacs were the antithesis of the Cistercians, so they had the same East End, this Bernardine East End. But it's hard to imagine them following a Cistercian liturgical arrangement. Ripon Cathedral, or Ripon Minster as it was then, not a minster of regular canons at all, secular canons, not regular ones, didn't follow a monastic rule, but again had a straight East End. So that doesn't seem to me to point to the necessity of a liturgical arrangement from the Cistercians, a lasting one, even though I fully accept the Cistercian influence in the 1150s and immediately afterwards. And then there were also, amongst regular canons, there were actually some orders which were very strict, much stricter than the Augustinians in general terms were. than Bolton. They followed the rule of St. Augustine as well, but they did copy the Cistercians in much more direct fashion. The Premonstratensians were one strain of that. The Arroesians were another. The Victorines were another. Bolton didn't belong to any of those, and there wasn't therefore any traces, as far as I could see, from 1267, when we start to see documentary evidence of Bolton, from the episcopal visitations then, and then on to the period of the Compotas, which I studied all those years ago. I don't see a single trace of any Cistercian influence at that time. So I'm hesitant about the lasting impact of the Cistercians, although accepting it for the middle of the 12th century. The other thing is, if this is unique or is extraordinarily unusual anyway, we have other cases which David mentioned of Augustinian priories where the nave continued in use after the dissolution, where it had been used for the tenantry or the servants of the prior, some lay audience anyway, a lay congregation anyway. But where there's no indication of anything similar to this type of recess. So I wonder whether, if it's unique, what's unique? Was it unique about the construction here rather than liturgical arrangements? One of David and my disagreements is really that he tends always towards liturgical explanations, and maybe from my background of an economic historian, but I tend, generally speaking, towards functional explanations. They don't necessarily contradict each other, but I just wonder in this case now whether the condition of this east end of the church itself then necessitated the shift of the bell code from where it was on the south transept to this position here in the 1240s. We do know from Witwain's visitation of 1280, where he spoke about dilapidation that is imminent in the church, doesn't specify where. And then in 1304, where in Corbridge's degree, he speaks about the poverty of the monastery and a great part of your buildings built of ashwood, especially that part above the stalls of the canons in your choir, just the other side of this wall here, is already threatening to fall and cannot be repaired without great expense. I wonder there whether that necessitated the shift of the bell code from the south transept, on which work was already beginning in the 1290s, to this new position in 1240. 50 years earlier, south transept may have always been in very shaky condition and necessitated the shift of the bell code. But those are just further ruminations on it, and at that point I think we should end our point in this and invite questions and contributions from you. As I said at the beginning, there's a lot of speculation, a lot of conjecture in all this, and therefore there's room for plenty of conjecture on your part too if you want to make some. So over to you.
Ian and David, thank you very much. I just wondered if there were any questions for two eminent historians whilst they're here to answer questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Fascinating couple of talks, particularly the dissertation on bell ringing, which had never occurred to me before. However, looking back there, from a practical point of view, I don't understand why the corbel should be so far down the wall. It would probably fulfill the same function if it was just underneath the platform, and if there were a long post supporting the platform, why does it need to be so long? And if it is indeed there, surely there must have been some way in which it was held against the wall, and there should be some evidence for the pinning of it against the wall. So the fundamental assumption that there is a relationship between the corbel and the platform, simply because it is placed in the middle of the platform, I think requires a bit of explanation from a structural point of view.
David, would you like the microphone?
That was the purpose of my explaining that the lintel has been removed, and the original lintel there would have been a timber lintel into which the thing would be carpented. So actually most of the structural support would have been given by the lintel, and the post is just adding further support. Why it's not higher up, I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that, but the corbel is where the corbel is. So there isn't a structural, I mean, you're trying to bring a structural engineering complaint. I dare say you are an engineer, and it does work structurally.
Are there any other questions? Yeah. John's held a minute. There's a question here.
Just a couple of comments, if you don't mind. The name Bolton is almost certainly a pre-conquest name, so it implies there must have been some kind of settlement here, and Bolton kind of suggests a church too in the kind of pre-conquest period, I assume. You mentioned the idea of a hermit, I think, I got that right, residing here and having use of a chapel before the arrival of the canons. And that's very interesting because that does happen elsewhere. And the example that springs to mind is Finkel, which was a cell of Durham in Northumberland, where a hermit, who I think was called Godric, actually gave the cathedral priory of Durham his chapel, and the chapel actually was retained inside, kind of englobed in the very elaborate church which the monks built in the 13th century, which is kind of odd thing, and I think there are other instances of that. On the bell issue, I mean, if there had been a bell in that particular location, a kind of simple explanation would be that it is a sanctus bell for the punctuation of the Mass being performed for the laity in the nave of the monastic church. Why such an elaborate arrangement would have been deemed necessary presumably to ring the bell at the right moment, I don't know, because it's very rare, but normally the sanctus bell is over the chancel arch in a normal church, but obviously this is a dual-purpose church, so perfectly possible it was in the position that's being suggested. But the other thing which I had wondered in the past, although amazingly, I don't know how this happened, I've never kind of remembered or noticed the famous alcove, is that the thickening of the wall in that position there is because it is the single surviving wall of a previous west tower. And if that's the case, then the alcove at the top would have given access to the upper part of that tower. Now that would require the coining, which marks the offset, the vertical set of coins there, to have replaced an east wall of that tower. And I say that partly because on the outside, the masonry, the other side of that thickened wall, is quite distinct from the masonry elsewhere, and it suggests that there are at least two phases here, that the whole thing is not one phase of the 1240s. And I know you mentioned the antiquity of the lower part of the wall here. And therefore that, if there was a west tower in that position, then that could be a 12th century construction rather than the 13th century construction. And the round-headed arch would have been a way into its upper part. And that's possibly absolute nonsense, but it's something that has occurred to me in the past.
Thank you, Mark. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, very briefly, the name, as you say, is a settlement here then at the top, of course, and the first part of the name suggests a dwelling house, I think, so the Bothel. So it suggests there was actually a substantial, important house here, not just a peasant's house at the time. So I think that points to the fact that this was a significant settlement place at that time. Hermits, there was great fluidity in the early 12th century, fluidity in terms of the different monastic orders that were then coming into being, but also in terms of, as you point out, as David mentioned there, of a number of places where there were settlements of hermits then turning into chapels, which then became taken over by monasteries. I have to say there's no evidence of that, either at MC or at Bolton. It doesn't mean to say it didn't happen, but there's no actual evidence of it. So we have to leave that as one of the mysteries which we can't unfold. The Sanctus Bell at Barnwell Priory, much bigger priory than Augustine, much bigger priory than Bolton. There were 6 bells at the dissolution there. There were 4 bells here at the dissolution. 6 bells at Barnwell, but there was also in the inventory of Barnwell at the dissolution, there was reference to a sacring bell in the choir. Sacring bell presumably being the bell that was rung at the consecration. So why you would need an elaborate operation just to ring the bell at the consecration, I'm not altogether sure. That's absolutely right. And the final one, the access to the tower, maybe I'll leave that to David to try and go with that one. But the only thing I'd say is that if there was an opening there at some point, as Thompson suggested, if it was knocked through, it would be a very inconvenient way to get into the church, really. A very narrow, those stairs are very narrow. The way into the church, but it wouldn't serve an obvious purpose of entry into the church. Anyway, David, you say something about whether this original West Tower, I've heard of that.
Well, I'm first of all going to address Ed's other points. It seems to me, I think I'm with you. I can't see you, but I'm with you in most of the points that you're making, I think, Edward. Certainly on the hermits and the Bolton thing, I think that's got plenty of mileage in it. I'm not with you on the tower. We've looked at it, or I've looked at it in considerable detail. The staircase and the opening all belong to the same structure as the sill walk, and the coins on the angle are actually the coins that are necessary to thicken the wall so that you can have the staircase. So I don't buy the idea that there's any sort of earlier structure there, in the same way that in fact yours is an elaboration of the Thompson theory, and I just don't think it works.
Probably got time for a couple more questions before we end. One here.
Hi, just quickly. I was just picturing this thing here. Would these walls have been painted or covered or plastered in any way?
Sorry,
Would these walls have been painted or covered or plastered?
Yes, I think the likelihood is they would have been, and they would have been probably painted. Most medieval churches were, of course, very colourful compared with the modern-day variants of medieval churches. So I'd expect the answer to that to be yes.
I think this is the last question, Dominic.
He was asking, is it actually unique, this feature?
I haven't been to every single monastery in the world, or even in Europe, or even in England. The only slightly similar feature is a doorway at Lanercost, which is certainly a doorway and is much lower down and communicates with chambers on the other side of the wall. So in that sense, it's just not comparable. That's the only feature that I know of in any monastery in this country that looks anything like this, yes.
Thank you. And final question, Dominic, for you.
I was intrigued about the question as to whether the wall passage was a liturgical demand or a practical requirement. And I say that because, seeing the date, Westminster Abbey has such passageways round all the apse chapels. I'd always been told that was practical. I then went to Reims earlier this week, which has also got the wall passageways about the same date, and whatever blurb I was able to read suggested there was a liturgical purpose to separate the practice of the Mass taking place from people who might be wanting to perambulate around for some other purpose. And I also note that, of course, this was blocked, so that there came a point where if you wanted to do maintenance, you couldn't use the passageway again, and that happened at quite an early stage. And I just wondered if you could shed any light on those two issues, and whether they're just mixed or not.
You're quite right. There is quite a lot of evidence that these passages were sometimes used for liturgical purposes. The best example and the most picturesque example is at Wells Cathedral, where for the Palm Sunday service, the choir was sent up into these passages and required to sing responses through holes that are specially made in the walls. So that did happen, but the vast majority of the time, I don't think, they were used for that. I think the vast majority of the time they were used simply for repair and maintenance purposes. So they serve a dual function, but mostly it's for repair. And they occur in every church. Every great church has them, because otherwise you can't replace the windows and can't, do the necessary repair. In terms of well, I think that probably answers it, doesn't it? That probably answers it. Yeah. Okay. He's happy.
Just one brief comment on liturgical and practical. If we are assuming from David's presentation there that there were no bells in the priory except the bells on the bell code, then they would have been needed for monastic services, which were very elaborately laid out. The Barmore custom book goes into great detail about when the bells should be rung. Now, on the ringing of the bells was the responsibility of the sacrist or the sub-sacrist. There was no sub-sacrist at Bolton, so the sacrist presumably had helpers. He couldn't have done it all on his own. And the bells were being rung for numerous services and so on. If you're entering from there, before that was blocked off, you've got to walk all the way down that passage up there to ring the bells for several services during the day and any sort of other additional times where you ring it. It's a pretty onerous job, practically.
That's no more than to say that they're following the Cistercian practice, which is that is the Cistercian practice.
Well, except the Cistercian practice was that the bell cote was in the south transept, not at the end of the nave. So it was, I'm just saying, it was a laborious job for the sacrist, whoever was going to do it. And it was much better when they rebuilt the east end and got rid of this strange bell cote, this area altogether, and probably then at the same point erected the central tower with the bells in which were there at the dissolution, and which presumably Prior Moon's tower was going to replace if it had been completed. I think that's about it. Thank you.
And thank you very much indeed. I think there's a splendid thought that having the choir up there on Palm Sunday, I shall put some ladders up and suggest it and see what happens. We can bring its use back. But that's been a fascinating lecture. Thank you very much. As the rector here, I often have this notion that wouldn't it be wonderful if I could bring the monks here back to, as we stand today, and they'd say, what are those cameras for? And I say, well, we can beam services round the world, and we do. And I'd love to see their reaction to those particular innovations. Equally, it would be lovely to walk down here with a monk from a bygone age and say, that recess, and he says, oh, of course, we had it for this reason, and we could solve the mystery at a stroke. But thank you very much indeed. We've been very privileged to have two very distinguished medieval historians to help us with the mystery of Bolton Priory, and we've been very privileged indeed and enjoyed your talk immensely. So a big round of applause, please. I should just add that in the tower there's some books on the history of Bolton Priory, should you wish to follow this further. Thank you very much again.